How did I know what was happening in laboratories or on factory farms? Well, I went and visited some of them. So this particular facility had 500,000 birds. I was on a tour. I took pictures. I asked questions of the tour guide. That was my way of getting firsthand knowledge. What are the best qualities of human beings? Probably the word I hear most consistently is compassion. I also hear courage and integrity and honesty. Nobody ever says, I think that dishonesty is a greater value. This idea that we have sort of very fundamental different values, I don't think by and large it's true. What we cultivate as solutionaries are not only the ethical foundation, but we also teach a way of thinking. Primarily critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking.
Good morning, Zoe. How are you?
I'm great, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's wonderful to have you back on as a repeat guest. We had a fascinating conversation about your own philosophical journey and the work of the Institute for Humane Education last time. But it's great to have you back on as a repeat guest, because this time we're going to delve deeper into a particular topic that relates to your new book. And I guess in our last conversation, I signed you up as a celebrity sentientist, because I think you have a broadly naturalistic worldview that we share. You have, at the same time, having a sort of rich sense for the newness and the potential unknown too. And you, again, share at least a sentiocentric moral scope. And you talked about this very simple ethical imperative of trying to do the most good, your MOGO idea, and cause the least harm for human animals, for non-human animals, and for the environment we all share too. And another theme that came through, which has been fascinating because a few of my guests have picked up on this, is the inspiration of Star Trek as a potential utopian idea. You also talked about the fact that I think Dr. Spock was one of the triggers for you originally going vegetarian, and now you've been vegan for over 30 years too. So there's an interesting theme there about a sort of sci-fi inspiration for our potential future. So yeah, it's great to have you back to delve a bit deeper.
Well, it's wonderful to be back. That was one of my very favorite podcast interviews ever. So I'm just so happy to talk to you again. And I do have to correct you on one thing. It's Mr. Spock, not Dr. Spock.
Of course.
What's interesting is that Dr. Spock also became vegan and promoted plant-based eating. He's a very famous pediatrician. And so he was way before his time, as was Mr. Spock. So both of them have had a big influence.
Yeah, Star Trek aficionados will be after me for making mistakes already. So
yeah, I didn't want you to get in trouble in the Twitterverse, so I figured I'd just nip in the bud right now.
Very kind, very kind. And thank you for the kind words about our previous conversation. You've done many podcast appearances, so it's great to be well thought of from the guest perspective. So before we get into your latest book project and mission, just for the guests that don't remember our previous conversation, how would you sort of reintroduce yourself to my audience?
Sure. Well, I'm the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education, which has a big goal, which is educate people to create a world where all humans and animals and nature can thrive. So huge, huge goal and vision. And we have a very specific approach to achieving that. And that is through education. We work with K-12 schools. We have graduate programs that we offer online with Antioch University. And we strive to be the thought leaders in creating a solutionary movement where people can learn, how do we actually solve problems to create this better future?
Brilliant. Sounds like an easy mission.
It's going to keep me busy my entire life.
Yeah, I think so. And the solutionary approach that you talked about there, you've done a lot of work around that. It flows through much of the work of the Institute, and you've written guidebooks and all sorts of other sort of supporting materials around it. But that's obviously the center of your forthcoming book, The Solutionary Way too, that I wanted to delve into today. So seeing as we've we have an understanding of your sort of philosophical journey and some of the big picture stuff. How would you describe the Solutionary Way? Obviously, we want people to go out and buy the book and delve into the details. So without giving everything away, I guess, what is the Solutionary Way?
Well, first, in terms of the book, I'm going to say the subtitle because it in a sense, it encapsulates the whole vision of the book. So it's transform your life, your community, and the world for the better. Also, a pretty big goal for a book. So the solutionary approach is one that we perceive as an antidote to polarization and a way for actually solving the problems that we face in ways that are good for everyone. And again, by everyone, we mean people, animals, and the environment. We are not a single issue organization. We believe that justice and compassion needs to be spread for everybody so that the world can be truly humane.
So that's the overview. Thank you. And to delve into a little bit more detail, I've seen you talk about, I guess, a lens that you use, a solutionary lens. You talk about solutionary thinking and different modes of solutionary thinking, and I guess a framework or a process that you go through as well. I don't know if you want to sort of summarize those different chunks of it as well to put a bit of extra detail on the idea.
Yes. So when you have a solutionary lens, you approach problems as solvable. A solutionary lens really dissipates the tendency toward either or thinking and side taking and us versus them approaches, which are so prevalent. So that lens allows you to move through the world believing that problems are solvable and looking, it's a lens, looking for ways to solve them, seeing, looking, perceiving, all of those sight words apply to this lens. And it's really a mindset shift. And what we cultivate as solutionaries are not only the MOGO principle that you mentioned of doing the most good and the least harm, which is the ethical foundation, but we also teach a way of thinking. So solutionary thinking is comprised of many kinds of thinking, but primarily critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking. And while those are not sequential, we don't think critically, in one moment and then think strategically in another moment. Critical thinking lies at the foundation because without critical thinking, without being able to determine what's true, what's false, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. So we need to begin with critical thinking and cultivating those skills so that we can be good systems thinkers. We can see the interconnections of many systems so that we can identify the causes of problems and leverage points for changing them, which leads us to strategic thinking. And then, of course, creative thinking is something that's happening all the time, hopefully. And the way it is applied, in a sense, toward the end of this thinking process is that we are bringing our creative thinking to solving whatever problems that we have identified. And then you mentioned the solutionary framework. So we have a 4-phase framework that enables people to cultivate these thinking skills, always maintaining this ethical foundation, and work through this process. It's literally a 12-step process with 3 steps for each of those 4 phases. And that can sound a little bit daunting, but without that kind of framework, we can misstep. And so the framework provides people with really a clear path or a way, the book is called The Solutionary Way, with a way to get from identifying a problem that you want to solve to actually coming up with a solution and implementing it. So I'll let you ask me other questions and then I can get into the very specifics of each of those phases.
Yeah, thank you. And the start of that process sounds like identifying the problem. Do you also do some thinking about what might come before that, which is, working out which problem is the most important? Because I guess one of the big challenges of your most good, least harm frameworks is that and because your scope is so broad, is that includes pretty much everything that could affect the environment, non-human animals and human animals as well. How do you think about prioritization? How do we pick the most important things to work on, and how can that vary for different people?
Yes, so we need to learn. So the first phase of this framework is called identify. But to get to that point, I'm so glad you brought this up, to get to that point of identifying the specific problem that you want to solve, you've got to expose yourself to learning about a lot of different issues. And so now somebody can come to the solutionary process and they know the problem they want to solve because they've already been immersing themselves in it. And yet we always encourage people, learn and learn and learn and learn, really dive deep and then identify a narrow enough problem, really starting with a problem statement that you have the capacity to solve. Now, I realize that I say that because we have been doing this work in schools. So we are working with teachers to bring this framework to students. And, fourth graders can be really concerned about issues of animal cruelty or poverty or climate change, but they're too young and don't have the capacity yet to just take on climate change or poverty or animal cruelty as a problem to solve. It's too big. So how can they narrow that down to something within their sphere of influence that they can feasibly solve? So I know I'm talking about fourth graders, and our listeners here are not going to be fourth graders, but even with adults, it is worth making sure that you're narrowing that problem, because we want the solutionary process to be successful for people. Now, I say all this as somebody who already told you the mission of the Institute for Humane Education to create a world where all life can thrive. It's so broad and it's so big. And you could be thinking, well, Zoe, you're not walking your talk. You have taken on every problem on the planet to solve. True. And we have identified a leverage point, which is the educational system through which we are working on this very, very big all problems. And with this book, part of why I wrote this book is because I believe that working within the K-12 educational system is sort of fundamentally working at the root cause of every other societal system. Because what happens in our educational system prepares us to be citizens, to enter the world as potential solutionaries, or perhaps not, because we've never learned how to think in this way and act in this way. So I absolutely believe that this is a profoundly important core strategy. At the same time, many of the problems that we are facing are so immediate, and we can't wait for a generation to become solutionaries to solve them. And we have seen the power of this kind of education to transform what happens in the classroom, to transform the trajectory of students' lives. I mean, students, they are so excited when they get to do this work and their education has relevancy and meaning. So I wanted to give everybody these tools because I often see people who really care about a variety of problems, whether it's the problem of factory farming or the problem of injustice, whatever the problems are. I see people without great strategies and tools and approaches for actually solving those problems. And sometimes the people who care most, who are most deeply affected by some of these problems, wind up doing work that is counterproductive to their goals, that they may burn more bridges than they build. And so the solutionary approach is one that I know, because I've seen it happen, that change makers and activists, if they cultivate it, can become vastly more effective And it can also improve their own state of mind, their own lives in really important ways, because we know that for many activists, burnout and depression is a huge problem. And we need to maintain emotional health and be in this for the long haul, because these problems take time to solve.
Thank you. Yeah. So you can start out with a super broad purview and a sort of crazily big mission and scope of things you care about. But then to be effective, you've got to narrow that down into something that's relevant to your sphere of influence. And a core part of it, as you've said, isn't just about, solving world problems or helping others. It's about this being good for ourselves and healthy for ourselves too. Yeah. So, and that hints at, I guess, what I wanted to come on to next, because for someone like me and probably many of the people in my regular audience, this sounds wonderful, right? This is obvious, right? We should care broadly. We want to fix problems and we want to be effective and we want to, let's just go, right? How could there be an objection to it? But at the same time, at least in the popular discourse, this feels very dissonant as an approach. And some might look at it and say, well, okay, sounds nice, but it's just breathtakingly naive, because the way things feel, I'm not sure this is an accurate representation of humanity really, but online discourse or the things we read about in the news seem driven by, as you mentioned before, polarization more than focusing on solutions. And polarization is a complex topic in its own right, but it'd be interesting to drill through some of the challenges it presents, because I guess one of the questions is, how are we going to persuade people to come on board and actually engage with this rather than just disregard it? And populism seems to, sometimes want to deny that there is even a shared reality, some sort of shared base of facts that we might even be able to agree on. The polarization can be so strong that people will reject the facts of the other group, regardless of the evidence. And that can work both ways. So there's almost like a denial of shared reality. It can also involve a denial of shared values. So you can have two groups or two individuals who are clashing heads over some topic, and they will refuse to acknowledge that underneath their concerns might actually lie some common set of values that maybe could be a productive starting point for a conversation. And another challenge about polarization is that often the focus is much more on blaming than it is on actually caring about a solution at all. And there are many politicians around the world at the moment who rarely talk about solutions, and mostly they're just whining and complaining about problems. And I can understand that, because there's plenty to complain about, but still, it doesn't seem particularly solution focused. Maybe we could work through each of those challenges and talk about how the solutionary way might try and engage people more productively. So the first one I mentioned is this idea of, sharing facts, sharing some sort of reality, sharing an evidence base. How can we come to agree on the root information that underpins the definition of the problem and maybe the solutions we're looking for? How would the solutionary way help maybe polarized groups or people work on a common evidence base together?
It's a great question. So there's so much that you just said. I agree with you so much. And I just would add to it that the media and politicians, the media drills down on the polarization, right? That's what we see. So that's what we think is the norm. I suspect that we are far less polarized than we think. But polarization certainly seems to be getting worse. We've been polarized many, many, many times in my lifetime in history. Like, polarization is nothing new.
Oh, no.
It definitely seems to be getting worse. But it's aided and abetted by the media and by social media, not just the owned media, but by individuals and social media.
Yeah, because it drives the clicks and it drives attention, and that's where the ad revenue comes from. And
yeah, totally. Okay, so back to your question, which is, how can we have like a shared understanding of what's actually true?
Yeah.
So in this solutionary framework, the second phase is investigate. So the first phase was identify. The second phase is investigate. And this requires a deep commitment to learning about the causes of whatever problem that one has chosen to solve, and to understand who's being harmed by this problem, who and what is benefiting from the problem and the systems that perpetuate it. This deep dive into investigation also demands the critical thinking that I talked about. So that means that you're really analyzing, where is this information coming from? What are the statements? How can we validate whether or not these statements are true? Very few of us have much firsthand knowledge about the problems that we are seeking to solve, unless they're problems in our own lives. But if we want to, so for example, when I first learned about animal cruelty and suffering in a variety of systems, it was because I read Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. This was shortly after the book came out, not long after the book came out. Now, how did I know whether or not it was true? How did I know what was happening in laboratories or on factory farms? Well, I went and visited some of them. So I organized a trip to bring students to one of the biggest egg producers on the East Coast. So this particular facility had 500,000 birds, and I was on a tour. I took pictures. I asked questions of the tour guide. That was my way of getting firsthand knowledge about what it was that I was learning about. Now, with something like climate change, we are going to have to trust somebody, because the vast majority of us are not climate scientists. So we're going to try. Who are we going to trust?
Yeah, you can't, not everybody can do their own research on every topic. I mean, it would be crazy to even try.
Right. So we have to be able to trust some. And so I go to those sources of information that have stood the test of time in terms of being reputable and having fact checkers. And I also go to scientists. Now, it's not as if every scientist doesn't have an ulterior motive. They could be being funded by ExxonMobil and, want to downplay climate change. But by and large, if you go to the IPCC and you read their reports, you're going to see many, many climate scientists who have agreed on this report. Have I read the entire reports? No. Have I read the summaries? Yes. So this is where we have to really push ourselves, particularly in a society that is promoting a lot of conspiracy theories and where we're going to get a lot of information, and how they're just simple questions we can ask ourselves. Who's funding this? Is there an ulterior motive? Is there an agenda? Is there a bias? Are they raising money? So one of the examples that I give in my book had to do with the COVID vaccine. So there was an osteopathic doctor on Facebook with a huge following who said that the COVID vaccines were dangerous. And there was a supplement that if you took it, you got COVID, you'd be fine. So the questions to ask are like drilling down. Like, it's easy to find anecdotes of somebody who got the COVID vaccine and then got sick or something like that. It's very, very easy to find anecdotes. So you have to read studies and you have to trust somebody. Are you going to trust this particular osteopathic doctor who's making tens of thousands of dollars on those supplements because he's selling them? So
it's always a red flag. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you bring your critical thinking to that and really dive deep to get the research that you need to be able to have some foundation for really understanding the causes of your problem?
Yeah. And is it helpful, and is it even possible in that investigation phase to try and keep values out of it, in a sense? So if I'm imagining trying to work with somebody else who might have a very different agenda than me, can we put our values to one side so we try and say, look, let's just try and understand the facts of value free at first and then go to work on it? How can you handle that challenge? Because I think that's part of the difficulty, is that the different values that we might have or the different perspectives we might have warp our interpretation of the evidence. They bias us in certain directions. There are certain things we want to be true. There are certain things we will deliberately ignore because they don't line up with what we want to believe. And in a way that sort of values polarization can get in our way of a sort of purer investigation of what's true. Can we separate those things, or is that naive?
I think we need to have some shared values. And frankly, the MOGO principle of doing the most good and the least harm to people, animals, and the environment, I haven't ever met anybody who says that that's not a good ethical principle. And I've asked thousands and thousands of people, because I've been in, hundreds and hundreds of schools and have asked students that question. Do you think this is a good principle by which to live? Everyone says yes. So that's a shared value, and that's a deep core value, doing the most good and the least harm. The other question that I have asked thousands and thousands of people, both youth and adults, is what are the best qualities of human beings? And the lists are always really similar. So, probably the word I hear most consistently is compassion. I also hear courage and integrity and honesty and generosity, and none of those, nobody ever says, when somebody says honesty, nobody ever says, I think that dishonesty is a greater value. And in the thousands of people I have asked this question to, nobody has said greed, nobody has said violence, nobody has said hatred. So this idea that we have sort of very fundamental different values, I don't think by and large it's true. I think it's the interpretation of our values in different ways. So, for example, we could all value doing the most good and the least harm, and some people are going to be pro-choice and some people are going to be pro-life, holding that same value. So I'm not suggesting anything Pollyanna-ish here where, we're all going to agree on everything if we just, adopt the MOGO principle. However, I think what pro-life and pro-choice advocates could both agree on is that it would be great if there are as few girls and women facing an unwanted pregnancy as possible. So, the idea that there could be no common ground is belied by just that statement. So if you can find some common ground, which most of the time you can find, then you can build on that common ground. And this is why the solutionary framework, by being focused on problems, solving specific problems, if you're going to do that collaboratively, you have to obviously agree on the problem. And you can find people agreeing on the problem. Now, you may find people agreeing on the problem and they don't get very far. So let's say we all agree that it would be great if there weren't mass shootings. I don't think anybody wants mass shootings. So I live in America, where we have the Second Amendment, and we have people who are very pro-gun rights, and then we have other people who are very pro-gun control. Both sets of people agree that we don't want mass shootings. It can be very hard to get much further than that in terms of an actual solution. However, if we come at that from that place of agreement, if we really are committed to investigating the causes of this problem, the interconnected systems that perpetuate it, look for where there have been solutions to this problem in other places, what's worked, what's failed, and we build on that together with respect for one another, then there is the possibility to move this needle forward instead of just arguing on the sides, which is what we tend to do. We choose a side. We think in a binary way. And once we do that, all the possibilities in between, all the creative thoughts that could happen outside of that binary just become invisible to us. And so that solutionary mindset, that believing the problems can be solvable and we're going to avoid that binary either or thinking is essential to getting anywhere. And that can be taught.
There are some people that I genuinely think we would struggle to engage in this project. There are people who are genuinely sociopathic. There are people who maybe have a sort of egoistic might makes right approach where they genuinely think that, others don't matter and it's just me and my tribe. And if I can dominate and use violence, then that's absolutely fine because I have a very narrow scope. But in a way, I'm not sure there's a great deal we could do with those individuals anyway, if they're really determined to follow that path. I mean, the door might be open. But for, I guess, the broader scope of humanity, and I share your hope that most of humanity fits into this, we might have different focuses or different ways of describing things, and maybe even some different values. But your suggestion is that there is at least some common core. And as an amateur, I think that does seem to be reflected in, there's all sorts of different work about moral foundations, and a lot of them fight and disagree with each other. But even there's some commonality. So they will talk about there being some groups where, honor or obedience or compliance or sanctity or purity might be important values that aren't necessarily very widely shared, or they're widely shared, but they're not as universal. But then there are other values that do seem to be almost pretty universal. And I think it does come back to your most good, least harm sort of principles, ideas of fairness and justice and concern for others and compassion. So, and those values do seem to spread very broadly across the spectrum of worldviews and politics. So I guess that's it, right? There's a sort of hopeful message there, maybe, that if we can draw people to investigate and share and understand the values they do have in common, that they can also see some potential solutions, or at least problems in common, even if they might disagree about the answer. So there's some hope there too. And again, is it an approach that you'd suggest in the solutionary way? Because I guess there's a couple of approaches. One is you've got somebody or a group who are bought into the solutionary way and off we go. Fine. Are there situations where you're deliberately bringing polarized groups together and trying to engage them together in the solutionary way? And do you take a different approach there, where you start with the values and then the shared facts and try and stop them starting with the polarization and the fighting?
So in my book, the book is 6 chapters. We don't even get to the solutionary framework until chapter 5. Now, it's the longest chapter in the book because the framework needs to be taught. But there's so much internal preparation before heading into that solutionary framework. And
before you even get started on the process itself. Yeah.
Yes. And I want to talk about what I have learned from doing improv comedy, because I think that there's so many lessons that transfer to this process. So can I talk about improv comedy?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm intrigued to see where you're going to go.
So I have been practicing improv comedy for a long time. And so I live in rural Maine, which it's not the comedy capital of anywhere, right? So it's not New York, it's not Chicago, it's not LA. However, we have this couple who moved to our county, who are Second City trained. They're brilliant. And they brought improv comedy to our community, and both as performers and teachers. So I started taking classes with them with my husband. And there are these 4 foundational rules of improv comedy. So the first one is to build relationships. The second one is called yes and. It's to embrace yes and I'll explain what that means. The third one is to bring the love. And the fourth one is to help others shine. So I did improv for a while and started realizing how profound these foundational rules of improv were to being a solutionary. I mean, really to being a good citizen in general, but to being a solutionary. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So this first rule of improv comedy is to build relationships. And what that refers to is you have two people coming out to start a scene. And one person may say to the other person, hey, Mom, I've entered us into the acrobatic contest at school for Parent-Child Day. And then the other scene partner says, oh, that's fantastic. We can wear the pink polka dot leotards that I bought on eBay last week. So what happened in that first scene? So the first thing that happened was that a relationship was established. There's a child and there's a mother. And the mother could call that child by a gender-specific name, so we know even more. It's sort of a boy and a mom saying, Brian, yes, we're going to do that. So a relationship has been established. Now, improvisers can get on stage and somebody can say something that they don't relate to, they don't agree with. It's not a relationship that they really want, but too bad. They have to do this work anyway. They have to build that relationship anyway. So about 8 years ago, I was a keynote speaker at a conference in Boston. This was an education conference. And one of the other keynoters was a very famous Harvard professor. And this was in 2016. It was right after the presidential election in the US. And Trump had just won. And he started off, like that was definitely on people's minds in the room because there had just been this election. And he sort of blithely commented that he didn't know anybody who voted for Trump. And I remember thinking, was he subtly saying that Trump supporters weren't worth knowing? So I live in rural Maine and I'm a CrossFitter. And that year I had joined a CrossFit gym and there were lots of Trump supporters at our gym. And a couple of them became really close friends to this day, really, really close friends. Neither of them who voted for Trump in 2016 voted for him in 2020. I consider myself part of the reason why. However, they're both Republicans. They have very different values around politics than I do. And they're really wonderful people. And by building these relationships, the stereotypes and the generalities had to dissipate. Now, there was another person who I knew at CrossFit, and when she realized that there were Trump supporters at our gym, she left our gym. She chose to sort of double down on her bubble. And I remember when she said, like, I have to leave. I'm like, are you kidding? This is the best opportunity you will ever have to build bridges because this community is amazing. These are people who are totally supportive. You're the last one working out, trying to complete that workout. You're exhausted. Everyone else is finished. And they haven't packed up and left. They are surrounding you and they are cheering you on. Everybody is supportive. I mean, these are some of the most generous people I know. Something happens to somebody in the community, everyone shows up. So that, again, building these relationships it prevents us from getting attached to those stereotypes and generalities. Okay, back to improv. So the other thing that those scene partners did, in addition to establishing a relationship, is they said yes and to one another. And what do I mean by that? So the first one said, hey, Mom, entered us into the acrobatic competition. And Mom didn't say, what do you mean? I'm not your mother and I don't do acrobatics. What the other scene partner said is great. Yes, great. Yes. And I got these pink polka dot leotards for us to wear. And added to the scene. The scene moved forward because of yes and, because of agreeing to the relationship and then adding to the scene. So how does yes and apply to being a solutionary? So earlier I was saying, like, can a pro-choice and a pro-life advocate find any common ground? So yes. And I've done that. And I've done that with some of these friends from CrossFit. I know that I have influenced a couple of people by saying yes and by basically agreeing that, we don't want young girls and women to face unwanted pregnancies. What can we do about it? What are where could we find agreement? And I have discovered that sometimes you can find agreement on Plan B, basically the morning after pill that prevents a pregnancy from continuing. And now not all pro-life advocates are going to move on this, because if you believe that life begins at conception, then it's very hard to accept even the morning after pill. But many do. Many actually will say, that could be a compromise that I could make, or what are some ways that we could reduce unwanted pregnancies? So this is all to say that when you say yes to something, instead of immediately disagreeing, instead of immediately saying, I'm in this camp and there is no bridge to you, if you can say yes and build that bridge, you both could get on that bridge together, there's the possibility of an and.
Yeah. And my guess is that there's got to be some limits to yes and, because there are some positions or stances or sets of values where you have to say no rather than yes and. But I guess your suggestion is to look for if there is something you can yes and build on, rather than just drawing the line too clean and too hard where you might not need to. I guess I just wanted to leave that. There are some situations where you genuinely have to, shut the door. Right? If we're talking really more extreme scenarios where there is a clearer no.
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking of?
Well, I guess I'm thinking of situations where someone is a genuinely bad faith actor or is taking a dangerous stance that directly threatens others, or, I'm talking about quite more extreme situations here where there might be a danger in yes-anding, because you're yes-anding something that is itself foundationally against your, MOGO principles and least harm principles. Their stance might be so clearly about harming others or implicating the harming of others. Is there a risk in yes-anding a position that really is dangerous? You could think about the dangers of fascism, for example, because I think that's one of the other things in the discourse at the moment is people love the idea of yes-anding and building on things and finding common ground. But there's also, I think, a justifiable fear that if there were a genuine bad faith actors or properly dangerous people and movements, that if we're too constructive and we're too open-minded, that puts us at danger and puts others at danger, because we end up appeasing groups or organizations where we need to actively be resisting and drawing a line and saying, we're done here.
Yeah, that's a real. So one of the things I'm teasing apart here is, so for sure, there's always going to be some people who are too dangerous you're not going to want to be in dialogue and solve problems with them anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's not the majority of people. And I would say that we also have to be careful to not assume that an ideology or like fascism, for example, we don't have to yes and fascism. We don't have to yes and an ideology. Yes and is in the context of a relationship. So somebody, I mean, how many people were once in the Ku Klux Klan who left, right? How many people were once eating meat who stopped, but who, I remember, one girl, who I knew was just like, I will never give up meat. And she was just very firm. I'm designed to eat meat. I will never give up meat. A couple of years later, she was vegan. So this is an approach that has to do with people, not with ideologies.
Got it.
And,
yeah.
So, yeah. And of course, there are some people you're not going to be yes-anding for whatever reason. I'm trying to think of a situation where one could actually be endangered. I mean, we've certainly heard about these things. I've never experienced this myself, in the moment where like I have been assaulted, where I could yes and in that moment because it happened so quickly. But I think that there are times where people have been in situations where they have been brutalized or they have been highly endangered, where they have sought to build a relationship in order to help that assailant see the humanity in them. Now, I've heard about these things. I haven't talked to individuals who said, yeah, I did this and I saved myself from being raped because I was able to appeal to the humanity in this person and for them to see the humanity in me. But interestingly, this sort of leads to the next improv rule, which is bring the love. So what do I mean by that? Well, in improv comedy, love just trumps hate. The more you can bring love to the scene, the funnier it tends to be. As soon as you start arguments, it tends to be not funny. And I think Larry David is maybe the exception that proves the rule. He can turn conflict into humor. But most of the time, when we bring love, it's funnier. So how does that relate to being a solutionary? So I'm gonna tell a little anecdote. So right after Putin invaded Ukraine a couple of years ago, I was walking near where I live with my husband in Acadia National Park, and we had gotten back to our car, and I heard a group of people speaking Russian, and I have learned to study a little bit of Russian. My family tried to adopt a boy from Russia. We spent about 4 years trying to adopt him, and we were never able to get him out of the country. So, and I've been to Russia. I love this language. I love this young man. I heard these people speaking Russian, and I felt this wave of anger because I thought, like, why are you just walking here on this leisurely walk? Your president has just committed this violent, unjustifiable act of aggression. All these people are dying. What are you doing? Like all these thoughts,
essentially
like,
unfolding a genocide.
Yeah.
On top of the 8 years of war before that. Yeah.
So that's what jumped into my head. And then these people, one of them came up to me because we'd just finished the hike and they had questions about it. And I just sort of took a deep breath and I treated them the way I would treat anybody, with kindness and respect. And I told them about the hike and they left and went on their way. And I was just struck by how easy it was for hate to be the immediate trigger and not love, right? Immediate. And of course, I don't even know if they were Russian, right? There are plenty of Ukrainians who speak Russian. So what did I know? And there I was, like, blaming them for going on a leisurely hike when, this atrocity was unfolding. Well, what was I doing? I was going on a leisurely hike. Yeah. So,
and it was by association as well. It wasn't individuals you'd seen do something bad. It was,
yeah. So I realized, like, first of all, it's not easy to bring the love. It's just not. Like, there you are. Let's say you're driving to work and you're in a lot of traffic and, you're frustrated. And are you bringing the love? Like, are you experiencing love for all of the people who are driving safely alongside you and in front of you and behind you? Probably not. But as soon as somebody cuts you off, you're laying on the horn, you're screaming, you're shouting. The hate comes like that. The love, meanwhile, like, we're all driving next to each other, following these rules. Like, we're not giving each other the thumbs up, like, hey, thanks, great drive.
Yeah, that's taken for granted, yeah.
Yeah, and so bringing the love is not easy. And we know how easy it is to bring the hate because we see it on social media constantly. We see it on the posts on X, Twitter, constantly. And I recently had the experience of having an essay that I'd written published on a very left of center news source. And one of the first comment, and I talked about educating people to be solutionaries as one of the antidotes to youth anxiety and depression, which are escalating, and we really need antidotes to that. So I had written about that. And somebody wrote, the first comment was, what a stupid word about solutionary. And it was very insulting. And the person even said they hadn't even read the article. So I decided to bring the love. I'm just going to bring the love. Like, let's just do it, see what happens. And so I wrote and I said, yeah, about 10% of the people who hear that word really, really don't like it. A lot of people really love it. I happen to be one of the people who really loves it. And then I talked about the article and I said, I really hope you'll read it because, and I talked, if you can get past the word. And then he wrote back and he read the article, and there was an exchange. It got less and less testy. And by the end, he was thanking me. I'm going to give you another example. So my organization, the Institute for Humane Education, decided that we would send monthly emails to our donors to let them know what their support is making possible. And so we decided we're going to go way back to, the last 10 years or 8 years or something of donors. Even if we haven't heard from them, we're just going to go back because they're in our database. So I got a really nasty email accusing me of, buying an email list, and people like me should just be shot. It was really, really hostile. And
wow.
I could have not engaged. I was like, I'm going to engage. And so I said, just so you know, and I went back in the database. This was a little time consuming, but I had somebody go back in the database and check, and he'd given $10 a really long time ago. And I said, you did give. And we're not, I promise you, we don't buy mailing lists. We never sell or trade. I'm going to take you off our mailing list. No worries. And then I got an email. I've never even heard of your organization. I said, well, here's the actual date that you gave, and you gave $10, and maybe somebody asked you to donate, and you just donated to them and you just don't remember because it wasn't important to you. Anyway, again, back and forth. And he said, thank you for being respectful to me. I believe you. My bad. And we're done. And so these things can take time and effort. Bringing the love takes time and effort. But I got to tell you, both times this happened, I was like, woo, I did it. I brought the love and I transformed things. And those simple successes, that's so, so simple. But bringing the love, I felt so good. It was so good for my soul.
Yeah, it's not just an altruistic thing, right? It gives you a buzz, yeah.
Yeah, and I think about, so I began my work in the animal rights movement, and I experienced a lot of hate in the movement. Hate directed at other animal rights, not just directed at vivisectors and factory farmers, but directed at other people in the movement who didn't align perfectly. I remember when somebody was just sneering at me and calling me a welfarist, as if she were calling me like somebody who's an axe murderer on sentient animals.
Yeah.
And it was so hostile and it hurt so much. There I am, I'm trying so hard to create a world that is humane toward animals and everybody. And so much anger is being directed at me in this situation. And I remember being at a conference, and the speaker was talking about strategies to create change. And then he opened for questions at the end, and one woman raised her hands and she said, I'm sorry, but vivisectors are just bad people, and factory farmers are just bad people. And I raised my hand and he called on me and I said, with all due respect, then, we're all bad people here. Like, are we wearing clothes that are produced through slavery or eating vegan chocolate that may have been produced through slave labor? Like, and then she, as I said that, she yelled out, "That's not my issue." Like, that idea that we are good or bad people based on, specific acts, as opposed to, do we all have the potential for goodness, and do we have the potential for evil, and how can we nurture the potential for goodness? And then I said, I married a vivisector and now he's a veterinarian. And she yelled, well, he was a bad person and now he's a good person, as if, as if things are that simple. I feel like when we do that, like, we're not building relationships, we're not yes-anding, we're not bringing the love. And all of those things inhibit our ability to be the best solutionaries we can be. And then just the last thing I'll say about the improv rules, the last one is help others shine. So it's really to look for, where is goodness happening? What positive things are happening in the world? How can we elevate them? How can we share them? How can we promote them to foster more of that? And again, those things are good for us. Right? If we're paying attention to where good things are happening and we're elevating those and amplifying them, we're going to feel better. And us feeling better enables us to do our work more positively and with a sense of evidence-based optimism, because we've seen positives happening.
Yeah. And I think one of the big suggestions I have for people on that front is, don't look at the news, look at the data. Because there's a lot of bad stuff in the data as well, but there's also quite a lot of good stuff happening.
So much good,
too,
yes.
Right? Whereas in the news, it's nearly always bad stuff. and the good news stories in the news always seem to be tiny, almost trivial things. It's really weird. Whereas the bad news is often big and catastrophic. Whereas when you look at the data and you look at, again, there's a danger of naivety in some of the graphs, and they can have their own perspective as well. But often the data is more optimistic than the news. Yeah. But thank you. That was a fascinating, you're bringing the rules of improv to finding real world solutions as well. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, because that was brilliant, because it sort of talked about, we have this challenge of polarization, but how you can regardless use the solutionary way to draw people in, find common values, find common facts, find potentially common solutions to problems as well. I guess there's another theme I wanted to chat to you about briefly, which is how people think about solutions in general too. So some of the responses you'll get to talking about solutions, one is a sort of naive techno-optimism, where people are like, just, we don't need to worry, whether it's climate or other problems, technology, innovation, capitalism will save us, it's just around the corner. And in a way, in its extreme form, that can become a sort of excuse for ignoring or denying current problems, because it's just, don't worry, there's a solution around the corner. At the other extreme, I guess there's a sort of doomerism, where people are like, look, we're doomed, the solutions aren't going to work, it's just too bad, we might as well give up. But there's a more subtle version, which is saying, we're worried that by focusing on solutions, you might be bypassing some deeper challenges about values and ethics and justice. And are we sort of bypassing the core of the real root cause of the problem in people's hearts and minds by finding a practical solution that enables us to sort of sidestep it and carry on our merry way? So I should come up with a question from that, but it strikes me there's a bunch of ways people might look at solutions and either over enthusiastically and naively jump on them, or might be more doomerist. How do you think your approach responds to those types of challenges? And is there a sort of way of navigating through those perspectives that makes sense?
Well, of course, we respond in a solutionary fashion. So I should say that the word solutionary, yes, it's a made up word. You may like it or not like it.
As all words are.
That's such a good point, Jamie. Oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. That's how I'm going to respond when anybody sort of negatively says that's a stupid word.
Yeah, next time, yeah.
The difference between a solutionary and a problem solver, by the way, is this ethical foundation of doing the most good and the least harm. Because, an engineer can solve the problem of damming a river or the problem of blowing up a mountaintop for coal removal. They're not a solutionary. They did solve a problem, but they're not a solutionary. So a solutionary solution is one that has the fewest unintended negative consequences and really looks at the deep and root and systemic causes of problems and solves them so that they don't persist. So I think you make a really good point. And as I was listening to you, I kept thinking the people who are saying like, oh, tech is going to solve it. It's all going to get solved anyway. I don't have to do it. Or the people who are like, we're doomed. There's nothing we can do. Those are great excuses to do nothing. At the core, they really are. Like, okay, you don't need to actually go to either place to say, I'm not going to do anything. You can just not do anything. And lots of people don't do anything, which is why Margaret Mead probably said there's no doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So I don't think that everybody needs to be a solutionary for us to solve the problems that we face. I think that school should be a place where we learn to be solutionaries and we have this mindset. But in the end, the great majority of us just go along with whatever systems are in our lives. We just go along with it. That's who we are as human beings. So if the system is meat eating and factory farming, we eat meat and we don't look at where it's coming from. And if the system is consumerism and let's get more stuff and that's, and we're convinced to do that by the advertising system, the media system, that's what we'll do. We go along with systems. So that's why systems thinking is so critical to being a solutionary, because we have to transform the systems. Now, I believe that technologies are going to play a really big role in this. I think one of the most powerful solutions to the problem of killing animals for food is that people want to eat animal products. And if we can produce analogs to animal products that are at a low price and that taste good and that they become the norm in the supermarket, guess what? Everyone's eating them. That's just how systems work. So we need solutionaries to be working on those technologies. But it's not going to happen by magic. It's only going to happen when there are people who go into food production and farming systems and go into politics and law and education and all of these other fields. And they bring this lens and they bring this work. And then we create these new systems.
And that's really interesting example. I don't want to delve into it too much detail because I want to respect your time, but there are a bunch of different perspectives about the sort of clean meat, the cultivated meat space. One is that people are really worried about it because they think it is an example of this sort of ethical bypassing, that if we can just transition from animal products to, clean and cultivated meats, that humanity's ethics won't have really changed that much because we can just get the same stuff for the same price. It's tasty, it's cheap, there's no ethical transformation. So that's a worry for some people that, okay, we've sort of sidestepped an ethical transformation that we should be making. A response to that challenge is to say, the animals don't care about that. Whatever it takes to save them, that's what matters. And there's another response, which is partly mine, which is I'm a bit more optimistic that if you might find a technological bypass for some of these problems. And I do find it frustrating when people say, I'm waiting for clean meat, I'm waiting for cultivated meat, or there's no point transitioning to plant-based agricultures in the meantime because we're waiting. Okay, I'm not on board with that at all. Right? I think we should just eat plants today. But I do think that those types of technologies, just given the reality of human social norms and psychology and the reality of a transition, will be a useful part of the solution. And that rather than bypassing people's ethics, I think it will free up their latent compassionate ethics and they'll end up in a good place anyway. So maybe, again, that's a sort of naive excuse I'm making for myself, but it is a really interesting example of exactly the type of problem we're talking about here where, there's a doomerism, there's a techno-utopianism, and then there's maybe something in the middle that is focused on the outcome we're trying to achieve, which is, not exploiting, harming and killing billions and trillions of animals. That's the problem we're trying to address. And then uses systems and technologies and critical thinking to approach to address it. So it's an interesting case study.
I could not agree more. Our ethics change as the more we don't have to participate in cruelty and suffering and destruction, the more our cognitive dissonance can shift. And our confirmation.
So hard to condemn something that you're complicit in, but once you're not complicit.
Yeah. I have no doubt that we're going to look back one day and as societies, not every individual, but as societies, and go, I can't believe we did that. That is going to happen. I am so not worried about an ethical bypass. I'm worried about how do we do the most good and the least harm? How do we cause the least suffering, the least destruction, and build more sustainable and just systems? And the rest follows. And I teach about these ethical issues. So it's not as if I'm saying, well, I'm not even going to talk about ethical issues. Of course I am. These aren't either ors. Again, like that tendency toward either or thinking. It just has us dig into our side, and then we're arguing here instead of solving the problem together here.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, the final thing I wanted to ask you about, if you've got a little bit more time, was the role of education, because as you said, this is where you've zeroed in on your work, and the Institute for Humane Education is this idea of education. And I love that focus, and in a way I've been trying to do something amateurishly similar with the sentientism idea, because in a way, that's the point of a worldview like sentientism, evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. Whether people recognize it or not, these worldviews, these ways of understanding reality and thinking about ethics underpin every single decision. So if we can improve those, we can upgrade epistemology and ethics. That has sort of a knock-on impact on everything we do. So I like the idea of zeroing in on education. And education, I sometimes fall into the trap of thinking education is just about kids. Clearly, it isn't, right? Lifelong learning is something that I think many people revel in, and to the extent they're able to. So when people look at, I guess, children and think about the solutionary way, one challenge might be, look, they don't have the maturity or the cognitive ability to really engage in this stuff, so isn't it going to be tough to apply for kids? But at the same time, people might look at adults and go, look, the problem with adults is they're already socially indoctrinated. They're locked into these defaults. They've got busy, pressured lives, and many of them don't have the time or the capacity, and entirely fairly, to think in a solutionary way about solving the world's problems, right? So they might say, look, you're not going to get adults on board here. How do you think about, who's got the best chance of adopting a solutionary way? Is it kids or adults, or is that even a stupid question to ask? How do you think it plays through kids and adults?
I think it's a both and. So I would say that the solutionary work, we have people who have graduated from our graduate programs who are bringing solutionary learning to preschool already, humane education and solutionary thinking already at that young an age. The majority of teachers who we are working with are fourth grade and up. And fourth graders can absolutely learn to be solutionaries. Again, the same thing. They're like, look at a big problem, find a local, a very narrow way to address that problem so you can have success. I mean, one place that every classroom could start is in their own school cafeteria, right? What's being served there? And that is such a powerful solutionary approach to solving a host of problems, is just addressing what's served in your school cafeteria, and all of the things that they are going to learn about systems, about our political and economic and agricultural systems, about like, where does tax funding go? Why is it that they have to be, if they're in the federally funded school lunch program, why do they have to take milk? Why exactly do they have to have cow's milk? Because of the mandates and the lobbying. I mean, it is so profound to learn about these systems that affect what they're served every day in their schools.
Yeah, and it's right there in front of them, right?
Exactly. And so we just had a group of kids who were exploring climate change and carbon footprint. And through their research and investigation, they felt like the food system is the biggest contributor to climate change. What did they decide they wanted to do? They wanted their school to adopt meatless Mondays. and they're getting, positive response from their school, right? Is it solving the problem of climate change or animal cruelty? This much, but it's a step, right? It's like that solutionary thinking is paving the way for the next bigger thing they'll do and the next bigger thing they'll do. And as they become adults, they have this mindset, whatever careers they go into, whatever professions, they bring that mindset.
And the impact it must have on them as individuals to see that they've actually affected this change must be quite mind-blowing. Because again, my sort of amateurish sense of the way most education systems work around the world is they're driven by memorization of facts. And where they're doing problem solving, it's problem solving in extremely well-bounded areas with closed answers. And when you get the right answer, you get a tick in the box, right? It's so rare to find this sense of, an open exploration, but also then to have a practical result that you can look at. It must be an enormous buzz for them. So.
Oh, and we just did a survey so we have teachers we've trained around the globe. We're in 18 countries right now. And we did a survey in 5 countries with students who had done solutionary projects. And 96% said that they learned more, they developed more compassion and understanding of others' perspectives. 92% said they liked working on a real life problem. Like these kids really find this valuable. And in 2018, we piloted our solutionary program in Maine. And so, that was 6 years ago. And we had one teacher who was doing this with her 6th graders. Well, we just interviewed those students. They're now 12th graders. And they still say that was one of the most profound things they've done. That was transformational. That unit that they did in 6th grade to learn to be solutionaries. So this has long lasting effects. And one of our graduates of our graduate program is a college professor, and she's having trouble with her college students because they didn't learn this when they were younger. So you ask, do we need to do this with students or with adults? So I said both and, because that's why I wrote the Solutionary Way. I already wrote a book for educators called The World Becomes What We Teach, Educating a Generation of Solutionaries. And anybody who's listening, who's an educator or knows an educator or who's a parent, I hope you'll get that book and you'll bring it to your school system. The Solutionary Way is for anybody who wants to be a solutionary, who wants to learn this approach, who wants to be more successful as a change maker, and who wants to feel better, right? That when you become a solutionary, it's not just the evidence-based optimism. It's not just the small successes. It's also the community you build. Solutionaries are really cool. Hopefully people listening are going to be like, hey, that was pretty cool. I want to be like that and have, cool friends. Maybe I don't want quite the diversity of her bridge building, but I just got to say that I feel surrounded by the most amazing people. And it's because they're fellow solutionaries and we're working together to build better systems. And it's incredibly rewarding. So I wrote the book for Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, boomers like me. I wrote it for everyone.
So I'm not a boomer, but my kids tell me it's a mindset thing, so I still count as a boomer. So I'm like an honorary boomer, which anyway, let's leave that. So let's leave that to one side. But thank you. That's an inspirational story. So it sounds like 3 years after our last conversation, you retain that optimism that we can actually get towards a more Star Trek future. And how do you think we can take these ideas from Maine to the whole of the US to other countries? How optimistic are you about really being able to take this out onto a sort of global stage and shifting the way education is done more broadly, or at least dropping solutionary thinking into education systems around the world? I guess part of the story is for people to go out and buy your books and...
So in certain ways, I'm feeling more optimistic. And in certain ways, I'm feeling less optimistic. And so in terms of feeling more optimistic, we're just seeing a burgeoning interest in our solutionary work. We're now working with the Department of Education in the state of Maine, our home state, and we're going to be training 200 teachers to bring solutionary thinking and learning to their students in the next school year. Yeah, we're a small state in terms of population, fairly big geographically, but we're going to be in every county. And Maine is a very poor state. So this is not like education for rich kids. This is education across our entire state. We recently heard from a new district in California that wants to infuse the entire district with solutionary learning. And it's a brand new district. We've been in other districts and counties in California. And that's bookending our country. And then, lots is happening in other places. So I feel optimistic because we are just seeing this incredible interest and growth in our solutionary work in K-12. Where I feel somewhat less optimistic is when I just look at what's happening in the world and I see the divisions, I see the polarization, I see the side taking instead of solutionary work. And that's really disheartening. Having hope is important, having some hope, certainly, but being generally like super optimistic and super hopeful is not a prerequisite for being a solutionary and solving problems. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, it matters to me personally if I feel a dearth of hope and optimism, if I'm truly pessimistic. Obviously, that doesn't feel good. But at the end of the day, I have to look in the mirror. I think I said this last time we talked. I have to look in the mirror. Do I want to have respect for the person who looks back at me? Do I want to live my life in such a way that I have few regrets? Do I want to have strived to make a difference? Absolutely. Whether I have hope that day or not, it's just not as important as having integrity. And the reality is that the more we do and the more we see the positive impacts, the more hopeful we will become. It is a positive feedback loop. So David Orr once said, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So just roll up your sleeves every day because it will benefit the world, it will benefit your community, and it will benefit you.
Brilliant. Thank you. The education space is such a powerful domain for that sort of thinking because every teacher that adopts this approach influences hundreds, if not thousands of kids. And every time you teach someone who's teaching the teachers, that just ripples up again. So the ripples can, flow out and long may they continue and connect up too. Well, it's been such an inspiration again to talk to you. Thank you so much. When's the book coming out and what's the best way for people to pre-order it or buy it when it comes out and share it around?
So the book comes out on June 25th. And I would love it if people would pre-order it because pre-orders, I want this book to be a bestseller like every author. To the degree that this book is purchased and shared and given as gifts and used is the degree to which we can build a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world for people, animals, and the environment. So, however people want to buy the book, I can tell you that buying the book at some of the big places will improve its rankings, which improves its sales. And I know that people may want to buy it from independent bookstore, which is great. Whatever fits with your values, just buy the book.
Wonderful. Thank you. And how about supporting the work at the Institute? Where's the main place for people to go there? As usual, I'll put the links in the show notes.
So our URL is humaneeducation.org. So that does have two E's in the middle there, humaneeducation.org. And we have loads of resources for educators. And of course, if you want to be a solutionary, come there too. And we have online grad programs. If you want to be one of those people who becomes a leader in this movement, which I hope some of your listeners and watchers will want to be leaders in the solutionary focused humane education movement. And I can tell you that our graduates they really are the leaders and we need more.
Yeah. And wonderful people to surround yourself with, as you say. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, I will let you go. Thank you again. It's been such a pleasure to have you back on Sentientism. Please do stay in touch and more power to you.
Oh, well, the pleasure is mine. You remain just one of my very favorite interviewers. It's just an honor to be here again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.